This presentation is an adjunct, if you will, of the newsletter posted March 8th, 2019, where we go into some detail on the labor force participation rate and the relationship with the unemployment rate. So to start with, the unemployment rate, the official unemployment rate, it's referred to as the U3 unemployment rate. That's when we say official, that's the one that people point to on a monthly basis to see the health, if you will, of the labor markets, etc. So the U3 unemployment rate, there, as it would imply, there are other measures of unemployment or underemployment, ranging from U1 all the way through U6. U6 would count folks that are U6 unemployment rate or underemployment rate, if you will. Counts people as underemployed. It would include people that were discouraged workers, for example, and also people that are working part-time but would prefer to be working full-time. At any rate, the U3 unemployment rate, very specifically, is that it counts the people that are not employed, first off, but they are actively seeking employment. So it's a very specific way of looking at this. They're not employed, but they're actively seeking employment. So when we were walking through this presentation, for the month of February 2019, the unemployment rate came in at 3.8%. And has fluctuated quite a bit up and down for the last year or so. It's ranged anywhere from over 4%, 4.1, 4.2, and then down to this 3.8% that we have right now. But it's gone up and down over that period of time, over the course of the last year and more for that matter. So what typically happens is that there are a couple of points to make right up front. When the unemployment rate goes up, it's not always a bad sign, if you will. Oftentimes we encounter what's called the encouraged worker effect. And what that means is that the people that are on the sidelines that were no longer part of that U3 unemployed had given up looking for work altogether, those discouraged workers, if you will. If they're on the sidelines and if they see the prospect of employment out there, they may start looking for employment. They may try to get back into the workforce or into the labor force, if you will. Specifically, the labor force is equal to those folks that are employed and those folks that are unemployed, the U3 unemployment rate. Again, the U3, that is U3 unemployed. So people moving into that labor force often kicks up that unemployment rate. In this case, this would be a good sign. It's called, again, the encouraged worker effect. So the real question, what this boils down to, is that the policy issue that kind of arises from this is that the Fed, or the Federal Reserve System, more specifically the Federal Open Market Committee, they're very aware of and very focused on labor markets because when it comes down to it, labor markets they're a major driver, if you will, for inflation and so on and so forth, because when we look at labor markets, that constitutes, so far as income is concerned, constitutes about 60% of all income goes to labor. And if you have labor markets that are rather tight, meaning you're at that full employment level, again, full employment basically meaning that there's zero cyclical unemployment, but without getting too technical on that, it's not that difficult of a concept to grasp. And if you start running, if the unemployment level goes too low, and historically, recent history at any rate, the full employment unemployment rate would be probably anywhere from 4 to 5%. So we'll say 4% at the low end. And once you start pushing in the past, we'll say historically, recent past in particular, we'll just say the last 40, 50 years, I think the average rate was somewhere around 6%, maybe a little higher than 6%, the unemployment rate. But again, we're definitely in that historically low level of unemployment, where when you start going down too low, you start running into issues with inflation because, quite simply, labor markets become tight, meaning that there are more jobs, if you will, than there are people that are available to fill those jobs. And that's that unemployed part that we talk about. And when you start pushing into that range, start getting any lower than that, it becomes very competitive for labor as a productive resource, and firms, the hiring folks out there, begin to compete with one another for those prospective resources, in this case labor, which could drive prices up, drive up wage inflation, if you will. So the Fed is concerned about this. The Fed is concerned about inflation coming from labor markets, tight labor markets, which they're presumably seeing this and identifying as the tight labor markets with this low unemployment rate. And in addition to that, they're also concerned about inflation in general. The fact of the matter is that with inflation, most of the inflation that we've been seeing, the fluctuations with inflation, if you will, over the course of the last few years, have had very much to do with energy, with the prices of energy. So in general, what happens when the price of energy goes up, when such things as tightening supply via OPEC, for example, driving prices up higher, you tend to see these bumps in the inflation rate, if you will. But what's happened over the course of the last several years, due to such things as fracking in particular, we've seen energy prices, of course, moderate significantly, meaning that if say for example, the price of oil is at $50 per barrel, and OPEC were to reduce supply, thus driving up the overall market price, if you will, the world price of oil, to some higher level, what happens is that due to this additional supply that's out there, that's available through fracking, it becomes economically viable for oil firms, oil drilling firms, if you will, to produce more crude oil, to pump out more crude oil domestically in the U.S. So the higher prices it adds to supply naturally. So at any rate, those are kind of two areas that the Fed has been somewhat focused on, and so it seems that every opportunity that they get, they've been trying to drive up interest, the Fed funds rate up a quarter point. And this is again for another discussion, but it's justifiable in terms of, yes, if inflation is on the rise and we see more inflation, on the horizon, then the Fed has typically acted in this manner in driving up interest rates. But let's drill down on this a bit. So far as I'll be very brief, so far as the energy prices are concerned, again, that seems to be a self-correcting mechanism so far as inflation is concerned. If the price of crude oil, for example, goes up, or natural gas, if you will, then what happens is that more oil wells, if you will, come online out west, like in the Bakken in North Dakota, or in Texas, and in the various shale deposits throughout the West, in particular in Texas, and we'll just say North Dakota, and it goes on. And also, so far as natural gas, if you've got a severe winter like we have had, increased demand for that natural gas, and such places as Pennsylvania's Marcellus Shale, you pump out more natural gas to meet those demands. So you have these blips with inflation in that regard, but they tend to come back down. That tends to that increasing supply, that availability of supply, tends to moderate that a bit. So now let's just focus more, if you will, on the labor market. So in the labor markets, what we've looked at. So we have the U3 unemployment rate, but there's another component that we've had on the horizon, if you will, in our discussion with the newsletter, going back to the year 2010. In fact, we've talked about the labor force participation rate. So the labor force, first off, remember, just housekeeping details to kind of get you back up to speed on this, because I've been discussing this quite a bit. Labor force is equal to those people, the unemployed, the U3 unemployed, those people that are not employed but actively seeking employment, plus the employed. That's the labor force. And the labor force participation rate then would be the labor force that was unemployed and unemployed, or employed rather, divided by the civilian non-institutional population. And the civilian non-institutional population includes those folks that are over 16 years of age, that are not in the military or otherwise counted in institutions, and in terms of prisons and nursing homes, etc. Okay, so labor force participation rate is important because that shows you the amount of people that are actually working. So not working and or seeking employment through the unemployed side. So think about it this way: the civilian non-institutional population that is divided up into the labor force and the not in the labor force. And the not in the labor force component is important because that constitutes folks that are retired and perhaps stay-at-home significant others, if you will, that are opting not to be working. But it also includes those people that are discouraged workers, those people that they're not employed, but they've given up looking for work, so they're no longer actively seeking employment. At any rate, you get the idea. So what we're looking at here in this next graph is just to give you an example again of the U3 unemployment rate. This is kind of a look back over several years, going back into the 1970s. And so so far as the average unemployment rate going back to 1969, so we'll say for the last 50 years, it was about 6.2%. So we are at an historical level. We're at a very, very low rate. And again, this is May 1918 that we're showing here at 3.75%. But this month, and again, that's for February, rather, 2019, we came in at 3.8%. So it's been fluctuating again around that 4%. But again, the point is that these are historically low levels. Okay, keep this in mind. So far as a U3 unemployment rate is concerned, it's been a point of contention, especially when we talk about the Fed being concerned about labor markets tightening too much, if you will. So this next graph is kind of neat. It's just a kind of a concentric circles type of a thing. It's not quite concentrics, they're not lined up, but you get the idea. What we're looking at is that the overall big picture, so the overall population in the U.S. is about 326 million. The civilian non-institutional population is at about, don't have it right handy, but I'm guessing it's 250, 260 million people. So again, that civilian non-institutional population counts those people that are 16 years of age and older, but it takes out the folks that are in the military, those that are incarcerated or otherwise institutionalized. So it's a subset of the total population. That's the civilian non-institutional population, and then that's divided up into two categories: those people that are in the labor force and those people not in the labor force. The not in the labor force component is about 95 million people, and so the balance would be included in the labor force. And the labor force consists of those folks that are employed and those folks that are unemployed, if you will. So again, just to keep this in mind as we're going forward. So drilling down, when we first off, when we look at this next graphic that we have here, this table, it's an important one because on an annual, we can only look at these numbers on an annual basis. The numbers I'm speaking to are the labor force participation rates broken out by various age groups or cohorts is the terminology that the census uses. And census are the folks that do the counting. They're the ones that are responsible for the current population survey or the household survey. They do this for the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but again, it's the census that goes out there and queries people to determine, if they are actually working or if they're seeking work, and what constitutes a household, and so on and so forth. All the numbers that kind of go into this. So looking at these age groups, the important thing is that again, the takeaway from this is that we're looking at the labor force participation rate. This is the focus. So if we look at the labor force participation rate prior to the Great Recession, if you will, from the end of 2007, December 2007 through June of 2009, but of course the ramifications have been felt, the fallout, if you will, is carried forward to today, in fact, and we'll talk about this as we go forward. So if we look at the labor force participation rate, again, that's the labor force divided by the civilian non-institutional population for the overall labor force of the 16 years and older, right? The overall labor force, it was at 66.6% prior to the Great Recession. So that would have been from 1996 through 2007. Drilling down on the age, today, of course, it's significantly lower. It's at 62.9% for the year, annually for the year 2018. It's gone up a bit since the end of 2018, and so this is a good sign. Keep that in mind. So it's at 63.1 or 63.2%. At any rate, this is the overall look for the overall population 16 and over. So drilling down on the actual age groups, we start with 16 to 24. We're looking at 10-year increments, but since we don't have 10 years to look at from 16 to 24, of course, because we start at 16 years of age. So what we'll notice is that first off, the 16 to 24-year-old age group, they had a 63.3% labor force participation rate back in, going back prior to the recession again, that 1996 through 2007, and currently, or at least at the, for the year 2018, came in at 55.2%. So that's a significant fall off. And how that translates, if we're looking at this in terms of trying to identify, it's a straight percentage, but if we're looking at this, adjusting it to try to find out how many people that are out there that have been kind of left behind, that have been marginalized outside of this labor force, that amounts to moving from 63.3% to the 55.2% equates with about 3 million people that are on the sidelines, that are outside of that labor force. They're not employed, nor are they actively seeking employment. They're not, again, this is that portion that we're looking at. So there are a lot of people that are on the sidelines that if they were participating at the pre-recession rates would be significantly higher. The same goes for the next three age cohorts, so 25 to 34, 35 to 44, and 45 to 54. They're all participating at lower levels than they were prior to the Great Recession. So this is a chart. This is rather a graphic table that bears some some scrutiny, looking at this and trying to determine why this is going on. And for the last two age groups, 55 to 64, and the group age group 65 and older, what we notice is that they're actually participating at significantly higher levels than they were pre-recession. So what does all this mean? Before we go on into this presentation, there are kind of two takeaways, two different slants on this, if you will. One is that people say, well, these younger age groups, in particular 16 to 24, that's probably because more of them are going to school. More of them are attending school and foregoing employment, for the time being. And you could argue that, and it's one of these arguments where were people actually going to school ages 16 to 24 prior to the Great Recession? Certainly. So that's something that's an argument that falls short for me. But regardless, we'll just set that aside for the moment. Significant number, but we'll set that aside. The older age groups, meaning from 25 to 54, if you will, they're also participating at lower rates. And that certainly should not be the case if our economy is booming, especially if there are concerns about labor markets tightening too much, if you will. So the takeaway from these fall off, is there are a couple of different things. One, again, is the education. Another one is people are saying that there's a skills gap that's out there. And I have trouble with the skills gap part. I understand where people are coming from with that. But for the most part, when you talk to people about employment, much of our employment, first off, we are basically in workshops and school all the way through our work life, no matter what it is. And yes, we are changing careers, and yes, people have to learn new things and gain knowledge, but a lot of this happens on the job. It's that on the job training, if you will. So again, we'll set that aside. But even the other curious part of this is that why are the folks that are 55 and older, if you will, and 65 and over certainly, why are they participating at significantly higher levels, higher rates rather? Even though, keep in mind that the 65 and older, they're going, I think, at a rate of some 10,000 per day was the last I read recently. But moving into that 65 and over category. So they're participating at much higher rates, but they're still, because of the size of the cohorts, because of the size of the baby boomers, right? Born 1946 to 1964, they are still exiting, if you will, moving from the labor force into the not labor force when they move into their retirement years. So there's that piece of it as well. So there are kind of two sides to this. So we'll keep this in mind. So you were looking at the younger groups not participating at the levels that they were before, and the older groups participating at significantly higher levels than they were before. Why are the older folks participating higher participation rates? Primarily because people have to work longer. They don't have the financial resources to actually retire. I mean, that's to put it bluntly. Also, quite a few people would prefer to continue to work, and they're able to work, so they think, why not continue to be productive? And that certainly makes sense as well. But we'll talk more about these, and we'll kind of draw some conclusions as we go through. So looking out over the course of the next 5 years, and the reason I did this, I wanted to show what's kind of what the future holds so far as the forecast and so far as labor markets, et cetera, are concerned. And so basically what we're talking about, the civilian non-institutional population, the monthly additions, they go anywhere from 180 to roughly 200,000 per month. And that will continue. That has been recent history and will continue to do so going forward into the future. So we'll just say 185,000 will cheat on the lower end of this, if you will. And that equates to this 5-year from 2018 through 2023. That equates to about 11.1 million people that would be added to the civilian non-institutional population. And if they're added to the population, if the labor force is growing, if you will, at a 66% rate, we're talking about adding 122,000 of those 185,000 from the civilian non-institutional population into that labor force on a monthly basis over the course of the next 5 years, which equates to about 7.3 million people, we'll just say in toto. So back to what we were saying about the labor force participation rate. So what this would do is this would alter the labor force participation rate, if you will, going forward from 62.9% in 2018 up to about 63% going forward to the year 2023. This is just on those additions that we were talking about. But in addition to that, what we're looking at is that what we're saying is that there are, in total, so far as the labor force is concerned, if we look at that 66% labor force participation rate, we're looking at about north of about 9 million. So we'll just say roughly a little over half of those people we would say are potential adds, if you will, to the labor force. That equates to about 4.8 million people. And over the course of the next 5 years, that's an additional 80,000 per month. So we're talking about adding in total to the labor force 200,000 people per month, if you will, into the labor force, right? So the next line down, the next row down, labor force includes the absorption of the sidelined ages, those 16 to 54 age cohorts. That equates to a total of, if we combine the 7.3 and the 4.8, that gets us up to about 12.1 million folks that would be added to the labor force over the course of the next 5 years. And that what that does is it pushes up the labor force participation rate up to about a 64.8% rate going forward. All this boils down to is that we're pulling more people in because of those folks that are on the sidelines, those additional 9+ million people that are on the sidelines that probably should be pulled back into the labor force. And reasonably speaking, we're just saying a 4.8 million number that would be pulled back in. And the last thing we're looking at is this marginal labor force participation rate. This is at 109.2%, which is huge, of course, because we're talking about adding 200,000 folks to the labor force every month, and we're only adding 185,000 people to the civilian non-institutional population. So we're actually creating more jobs than are being added in total number of people in terms of the CNP. So it's an interesting concept, but the takeaway is that there are a lot of people that are still on the sidelines that should be drawn back into this labor force. And frankly, moving this labor force participation up rather modestly, if you will result in bringing a lot of those people back into the labor force. And the argument, of course, that what we're heading for with this is that we're saying that this should provide us with a better picture so far as how the labor markets are actually operating, how they're actually functioning, and also highlight the fact that the Fed, as in the Federal Reserve, or the FOMC, the policy-making authority, the monetary policy-making authority, they should be very careful about driving up interest rates under the with the under the auspices, under the with their rationale being that the labor markets are too tight. The fact of the matter is that there is a lot of room for additions, if you will, in the labor force, and we'll wrap that up as we go forward in this presentation toward the end. So this is, again, the labor force participation rate. Just to give you some ideas, this is graphically what we're looking at. So we were at 66.6% from 1996 through 2007, and then the Great Recession hit, and also we're looking at what? Retirees. This is kind of the argument, is that a lot of people are retiring. The baby boomers are rolling through. The folks that are born 1946 to 1964, they're rolling through, which is tamped down, as forced the labor force participation rate to be as low as it was. And just as an aside, it should be noted that a lot of the forecasts were for labor force participation rate not to get back above 63%, and we are above 63%. So that puts us at the highest level. Say, for example, in February 2019, we're at the highest level than we've seen in 5 years. So these are all very good signs. Again, this is the entire 16 years and older crowd. So this would be the entire civilian non-institutional population, labor force associated with it. So just looking at this one again, at the 16 to 24-year-olds, just to graphically see this. And prior to the Great Recession, it was at 63.3%. So 1996 through 2007, the labor force participation rate for the 16 to 24-year-olds was at 63%, and after, currently it's at 55.2% as of 2018. Again, we want to make sure we address this as we wrap this up. So the other part of this, of course, is the labor force participation rate for the 65 years and older. So why are people participating at significantly higher levels than they have been in the past? There are a variety of reasons. One, of course, we've already talked about. People are not unable to do so financially. The other one that we also pointed to was that a lot of these jobs are that the 65 years and older they can do. There's not as much hard labor, if you will, that would be associated with it. We're not digging ditches so much as we're operating on computers. So to kind of wrap things up, and I want to wrap this up here, and that is that, so we're kind of faced, the Fed is looking at this and they're saying, well, there's the labor markets are tight. And so the reality is this, that okay, so we'll accept that more kids are going to school, 16 to 24-year-olds. That's fine, and we'll also accept the fact that more of the baby boomers are retiring, even though they're staying, if you will, in the labor force participation rate at record levels. There's still quite a few that are actually retiring. The problem is that if we look back at those age groups, starting from age 16 up through age 54, if you will, post-recession, they're all of those age groups from age 16 to 54. They're participating at lower rates than they were prior to the Great Recession. So the real kind of the nub of this is that the question comes up: why would this? How can this be the case if the labor markets are so tight? Meaning, of course, what we're saying is that there are people that are retiring, and if nothing else, those jobs should be backfilled. Meaning that you not only should they be the 16 to 54-year-old age group be participating at pre-recession levels. I would argue that they should be participating at significantly higher levels to make up for those people that are leaving the workforce, leaving the labor force altogether as they move off into retirement. So these are all things to consider as we go forward, and we will continue to pay close attention. And I encourage you to continue reading the newsletter, and feel free to send questions along if you have as they come up. But remember, this labor force participation rate is absolutely critical as we go forward, and we're above 63%. I think we're at 63.1 or 63.2, which is the best that we've had in 5 years. And I suspect that we'll continue to drive that. That number will continue to go up. But the takeaway from all this is that we have room for additional growth so far as the labor markets are concerned, if we're using this labor force participation rate number as kind of a guideline for at least the next 5 years. So if the economy continues to move in that direction, then we have room. We have ample room so far as our labor force to absorb those jobs that are needed out there. And as a side note, with those additional folks that are added to the labor force and ultimately land in the employment roles, this is also a good sign for economic growth period so far as the gross domestic product, the GDP, and also so far as tax collection is concerned. Because with the payroll taxes that you're getting for your income, if you will, keep in mind that even with tax cuts, there's an increased demand for the labor and so on and so forth. You could argue back and forth on that, but the part that's inarguable is that with the more people that are employed, there's a greater contribution for those payroll taxes, especially we're talking about Social Security and Medicare, which is about 15%. So keep this in mind as we're going forward. This is absolutely critical for a variety of reasons. Thank you.